picture this. You've just overthrown a 300-year-old dynasty.
Right, the Romanovs are gone.
Exactly. You have the guns, you control the railways, you've got the telegraph offices, the streets. I mean, the massive armed population is entirely behind you.
You hold all the cards.
Right. And what do you do with that absolute, undisputed power? You literally walk across town and voluntarily hand it to a group of wealthy bankers and aristocrats who are absolutely terrified of you.
It genuinely defies every conventional assumption we have about how power operates.
It makes no sense.
No, it really doesn't. If
Well-
you read, say, Machiavelli or Thomas Hobbes, they would tell you that whoever holds the monopoly on violence dictates the terms of the state.
Yeah, that's just basic political science.
Right. But in Petrograd, in February 1917, the workers and soldiers held that monopoly on violence, and they used it to install their own class enemies into power.
Which is just wild. So today we are unpacking what has to be the most baffling political suicide in modern history. We're taking a deep dive into the explosive, frankly, deeply chaotic year of 1917 in Russia.
And we have some incredible source material for this.
We really do. Our primary lenses today are chapters 8 through 12 of Leon Trotsky's monumental history of the Russian Revolution, alongside Vladimir Lenin's radical theoretical blueprint, The State and Revolution.
Plus, we'll be pulling in some modern historiography from scholars like Alexander Rabinowitz to kind of ground it all.
Yeah, because our mission today is to completely dismantle the traditional Cold War-era narratives that surround this period. For you listening, you've probably heard the dominant story, right?
The one pushed by both Soviet propagandists and Western detractors.
Exactly. This idea that the Russian Revolution was this smoothly orchestrated, monolithic march toward a predetermined future.
Like it was perfectly executed by this unified Bolshevik machine.
Right. But reading these primary sources, you realize that narrative is pure fiction. I mean, the reality of 1917 was defined by ideological paralysis, bitter factional infighting, and leaders basically just making it up as they went along.
It was messy. We are looking at the raw, improvised mechanics of political power.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand those mechanics, we have to start right in the immediate aftermath of the February Revolution.
Right after Tsar Nicholas II abdicates.
Yeah, and we need to examine this utterly bizarre political architecture that emerged from the rubble, the whole concept of dvovlasti.
Dvovlasti, right.
Yeah.
Dual power, or as it literally translates, twin powerdom.
Twin powerdom.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how this actually functioned on the ground, because it wasn't just some abstract theoretical concept. It was a physical reality in the capital.
It was two competing centers of gravity.
Yeah. So on one side, you have the provisional government operating out of the Mariinsky Palace.
These are the former Duma members, right?
Exactly. The cadet party leader, Pavel Milikov, Prince Lvov. Basically, the liberal bourgeoisie who wanted to construct a Western capitalist parliamentary democracy.
And they represented the formal legal authority that was recognized by the international community. But, and this is the crazy part, they possessed literally no physical mechanism to enforce their will.
None at all. I mean, the Minister of War, Alexander Grichkov, famously admitted in a private letter that the provisional government had no real power.
Right. He said their orders were executed only to the extent permitted by the other center of gravity.
Which was the Petrograd Soviet, the Soviet of workers and soldiers deputies operating out of the Tauride Palace.
And for you listening, if you're familiar with the era, you already know the Soviet wasn't just some talking shop.
Oh, no. It was the nervous system of the country. I was reading the daily logs of the Soviet Executive Committee from March 1917, and it's just astonishing.
Yeah, they controlled everything.
Literally everything. If the provisional government wanted to move a troop train, the railway workers wouldn't touch it until the Soviets stamped the order.
If they drafted a decree, the telegraph operators wouldn't transmit it unless a Soviet commissar cleared it.
So the Soviet held the actual material apparatus of the state. And yet, as Trotsky brilliantly analyzes, the leadership of the Soviet refused to formally take the reins.
And we should clarify, that leadership was overwhelmingly dominated by the moderate socialist parties.
Right, the Mensheviks and the Social Revolutionaries, the SRs.
Yeah. Trotsky mockingly refers to this arrangement as double bookkeeping. He calls it the bookkeeping of the kings and the prophets.
I love that quote. The bourgeoisie were the kings on paper, but the socialists in the Soviet held the moral and physical authority of the prophets.
But the paradox here is just staggering. Why did the Menshevik leaders, people like Julius Martov or Irakli Tsereteli, deliberately yield power?
Well, wait, if you have the guns, the numbers, and the momentum, why on earth would you hand the keys to the castle to the old liberal elites? Isn't that just political suicide?
It seems like it, right? It's tempting to write it off as cowardice, but reading their contemporary speeches, you realize they were operating from a place of intense, rigid ideological conviction.
They were completely trapped in an orthodox Marxist straitjacket.
Exactly. And that ideological straitjacket was the stagist theory of history.
Right, classical Marxism, or at least their interpretation of it.
Yeah, as interpreted by the Mensheviks. It dictated that societal development was strictly linear.
So a nation must transition from feudalism to capitalism.
Right. And only after capitalism has fully matured, exhausted its productive forces, and created this massive educated proletariat, only then could society advance to socialism.
I want to dig into the nuts and bolts of that logic. From their perspective, the February Revolution had just toppled a feudal autocrat.
So history demanded a bourgeois democratic stage.
Yeah, they looked at the French Revolution of 1789 as their literal blueprint. In their minds, Russia in 1917 was economically backward, mostly agrarian, and just practically medieval compared to industrial powerhouses like Germany or Britain.
Which led them to a deeply fatalistic conclusion. They argued the Russian working class was historically immature.
So to seize power now, in their eyes, would be a disastrous historical short circuit.
Exactly. It would lead to an isolated, impoverished dictatorship that would inevitably collapse under its own weight.
Therefore, a bourgeois revolution inherently required bourgeois leaders.
It's as if they viewed themselves as historical custodians rather than political actors.
That's a great way to put it. They essentially handed the keys to Prince Lvov and the industrialists, telling them, history dictates that you must exploit us and develop capitalism for the next 50 years while we sit in the opposition and pressure you.
And the liberal bourgeoisie was terrified of this arrangement.
Oh, completely. They didn't want to rely on the goodwill of an armed, radicalized populace.
You have figures in the provisional government complaining that the Soviet was running a parallel government right under their noses.
While Soviet leaders were simultaneously standing on platforms, denying that dual power even existed, they were desperately trying to reassure the bourgeoisie that the government was fully in control.
It was an entirely unsustainable equilibrium.
It really was. And the conventional historical wisdom usually steps in here to say, but the Bolsheviks were different.
Right. The myth that the Bolsheviks were the hardcore, uncompromising revolutionaries waiting in the wings to smash this compromise.
But diving into the archives from March 1917 completely incinerates that myth.
Yeah, this is one of the most heavily obscured realities of the entire revolution.
Because in those initial weeks following the February uprising, the Bolshevik Party was just as paralyzed by the stagist theory as the Mensheviks.
Without Lenin, who is still stuck in exile in Switzerland, the local Bolshevik leadership in Petrograd was totally adrift.
Let's look at the editorial board of Pravda, the Bolshevik newspaper. Before mid-March, you had younger, more radical organizers like Alexander Shliapnikov and Vyacheslav Molotov running the paper.
And they weren't exactly calling for an immediate armed uprising.
No, but they were deeply hostile to the provisional government. They were actively telling the workers not to trust the bourgeoisie for a second.
But that aggressive posture changes overnight in mid-March.
Right, when two very senior figures returned to Petrograd from exile in Siberia.
Lev Kamenev and Joseph Stalin.
Yeah. And because they were old Bolsheviks with immense seniority in the party apparatus, they immediately ousted that younger editorial board.
They just took control of Pravda and executed a sharp, dramatic rightward shift in party policy.
I was reading the transcripts of their editorials from those weeks, and it honestly reads like an alternate timeline.
Kamenev and Stalin essentially adopt the Menshevik platform.
They really do. They outline three major policy shifts. First, conditional support for the provisional government.
Right, they use this specific formula insofar as.
Yeah, meaning the Bolsheviks would support the bourgeois government insofar as it didn't betray the revolution.
Which is a completely meaningless caveat.
Totally meaningless. It just meant granting the government breathing room to consolidate its power against the workers.
And the second shift was even more radical in its betrayal of prior Bolshevik commitments. They endorsed the continuation of World War I.
Which is a huge point. For years, Lenin's defining stance was that the First World War was an imperialist slaughterhouse.
His whole thing was that the goal of socialists should be to turn the imperialist war into a civil war against their own ruling classes.
Right. Yet here are Kamenev and Stalin suddenly writing in Pravda that because the Tsar is gone, The Russian army is now fighting a defensive war to protect a free republic.
They literally told the soldiers at the front to answer the enemy with bullet for bullet and shell for shell.
Unbelievable. And their third initiative was to actively seek organizational unification with the Mensheviks.
Yes, Stalin argued at a party conference in late March that the ideological differences between the two factions were artificial.
He actually said they should merge back into a single social democratic party under the leadership of the moderate Menshevik Tsereteli.
What's fascinating here is how this exposes that without their chief theoretician, the Bolsheviks were on the verge of becoming just another left-wing appendage to a capitalist government.
I have to bring up a specific concept Stalin articulated during this period because it perfectly illustrates this whole ideological muddle.
Well, the division of labor theory.
Yes. He proposed a division of labor between the classes. He argued that the Soviets' job was to take the initiative in driving social changes, while the provisional government's role was to formally fortify those conquests into law.
Right.
It's like letting a fox guard the hen house, but asking the fox to please only act as a security consultant.
That's exactly it. It fundamentally misunderstands the antagonistic nature of class power.
So, to understand how two senior Bolsheviks could arrive at such a compromising position, we really need to look at Trotsky's psychological profiles of them in his history.
Which is fascinating reading. Now, Trotsky is obviously a partisan source. We have to acknowledge that.
Oh, absolutely. But his analysis of Kamenev and Stalin's differing methodologies in March 1917 is incredibly revealing about the nature of revolutionary leadership.
Let's start with Kamenev. He was widely considered one of the most educated, theoretically grounded Marxists in the party.
He was, yeah. But Trotsky diagnoses him as lacking a broad revolutionary will.
Kamenev was an intellectual who treated Marxist formulas as rigid dogmas rather than living guides to action.
Right. So when reality didn't match the textbook, like when the workers held power, but the bourgeois stage hadn't completed, Kamenev's instinct was to force reality back into the theoretical box.
He was inherently cautious. He always gravitated toward the right wing of the party during moments of acute crisis.
Now, regarding Stalin, I want to introduce some friction here, because Trotsky describes Stalin in 1917 as a gray spot who gave out a dim and inconsequential light.
Yeah, he quotes the Menshevik chronicler Nikolai Sukhanov to back this up.
Right. Trotsky frames Stalin as a mere empiric who lacked any creative intellectual horizon, just someone who cautiously adapted to whatever the prevailing mood was. But my question is Trotsky just writing history backward here? I mean, is he deliberately minimizing Stalin's role in 1917 to settle scores from the 1930s when Stalin exiled him?
It's a very necessary skepticism. But modern historiography, particularly the deep archival work by scholars like Rabinowitz, actually corroborates the essence of that characterization for this specific period.
Really? So he wasn't just being petty?
No, not entirely. Stalin in March 1917 was not the towering totalitarian figure of the 1930s. He was an organizer, a committee man.
A behind-the-scenes guy.
Exactly. Without Lenin to generate the high-level theoretical architecture, Stalin defaulted to his organizational instincts.
Which were to seek unity, avoid isolation,
and drift with the powerful current of patriotic democratic compromise that was sweeping Petrograd after February.
So if this trajectory had held, if the Bolsheviks had merely become the left wing of a united social democratic bloc offering conditional support to the bourgeoisie, the October Revolution simply would not have happened.
The Bolsheviks would have vanished into the machinery of dual power.
They were completely drifting toward irrelevance. And that sets the stage for what is arguably the most dramatic, singular intervention by an individual in the history of the 20th century.
It takes a bombshell arrival to shatter this cozy arrangement.
The arrival at the Finland station, April 3rd, 1917.
Let's paint the physical reality of this moment because it's so often mythologized.
Yeah, so Lenin has been trapped in Switzerland. The German High Command, in this calculated move of asymmetric warfare, allows him to travel across their territory in a sealed train.
They're betting that he will infect Russia with the bacillus of anti-war radicalism and pull Russia out of the conflict.
Right. So he arrives in Petrograd late at night. The Menshevik leadership of the Soviet, including their chairman, Nikolai Chkheidze, is at the station to greet him.
And they have orchestrated a massive welcome. Military bands, searchlights illuminating the square, tens of thousands of workers and sailors.
It's a huge spectacle, and Chkheidze gives this very formal, nervous speech welcoming Lenin back, but he explicitly warns him not to disrupt the fragile unity of the revolution.
And the mechanics of Lenin's response are incredible.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He doesn't debate Czexic. He barely acknowledges him.
No, he literally turns away from the official welcoming committee.
He looks out at the sea of armed sailors and workers and gives a speech hailing them as the vanguard of the worldwide socialist revolution.
He completely ignores the institutional framework of dual power in his first 30 seconds on Russian soil.
And the very next day, April 4th, he presents his formal programmatic document to the party delegates, the April Theses.
This wasn't just a pivot. It was a declaration of absolute political war against his own party's central committee.
When you break down the actual arguments in the April Theses, it's easy to see why the party leadership thought he had lost his mind.
Oh, they thought he was crazy.
He demanded an immediate end to the war, characterizing it as a predatory imperialist slaughter that could not be justified by the existence of a bourgeois republic.
He demanded zero support for the provisional government.
Right, no, insofar as caveats, just relentless exposure of their capitalist nature.
But most explosively, he demanded a complete transfer of state power to the Soviets.
All power to the Soviets.
Yes, he argued that the old stage theory was obsolete. The workers and peasants needed to bypass the bourgeois parliamentary republic entirely and establish a republic of Soviets from the bottom up.
And just to finalize the break, he demanded the party drop the name Social Democratic.
Because he felt it was irreparably stained by the Mensheviks collaborating with the bourgeoisie.
Exactly. He wanted to rename themselves the Communist Party.
I was looking at the contemporary reactions to this, and it was utter horror across the entire political spectrum.
Oh yeah, the liberal press immediately branded him a German agent. The moderate socialists called it the ravings of a madman.
But the most intense backlash came from within his own ranks.
Right. Kamenev actually published an editorial in Pravda explicitly disavowing the theses.
He stated they were Lenin's personal views, not the party's.
Kamenev argued that Lenin's premise that the bourgeois democratic revolution was finished was a completely unacceptable abandonment of Marxism in favor of anarchist adventurism.
Even the rank-and-file soldiers who had cheered him at the train station were initially confused.
Yeah, and hostile when they fully grasped his anti-war position.
The Volgin Regiment, which had actually initiated the February mutiny against the Tsar, briefly considered sending troops to arrest him.
So Lenin was completely isolated, outvoted in his own central committee, facing the threat of physical violence.
Which raises the central mechanical question of this deep dive.
How does he win? I mean, how does one man, recently returned from a decade in exile, turn around an entire entrenched political machine that is dead set against him?
It wasn't magic. It was a very specific organizational strategy.
Right. He recognized that the intellectual leadership of the party was calcified.
They were paralyzed by their own theoretical texts.
So Lenin bypassed the Central Committee entirely. He went directly to the radical working-class base of the party.
He focused his energy on the Vyborg District Committee in Petrograd.
Let's detail what the Vyborg district actually was, because this wasn't some neighborhood of cafes and intellectuals.
No, this was the industrial heart of the Russian Empire.
It was packed with massive metallurgical plants, textile factories, tens of thousands of highly concentrated, heavily armed, and incredibly militant proletarians.
Exactly. Lenin understood that while the intellectuals like Kamenev were agonizing over the definition of the bourgeois stage, the actual workers in the Vyborg district were experiencing the brutal reality on the ground.
Right. The provisional government wasn't giving them the 8-hour workday.
The war was still killing their brothers.
The food shortages were getting worse. The base of the party was already organically radicalizing far beyond the leadership.
Lenin essentially gave the workers the theoretical justification for what their instincts were already telling them to do.
Through sheer force of argument, endless speeches at factory gates, and brutal factional organizing, he initiated what Trotsky calls the rearming of the party.
Within 3 weeks, he leveraged the radicalism of the Vyborg district to force a new party congress,
where he decisively defeated Kamenev's faction and won the majority.
It is one of the most profound case studies in political leverage. Lenin proved that historical momentum is not just some automatic structural process.
Right. Sometimes it hinges entirely on the intellectual clarity and sheer willpower of a single individual challenging their own supporters.
But, and this is crucial, convincing his party to adopt the slogan, "All power to the Soviets," was only half the battle.
Right, because to justify actually seizing power in a country that hadn't fully developed capitalism, Lenin had to completely dismantle the prevailing Marxist orthodoxy regarding the state itself.
He needed a watertight theoretical weapon.
And that necessity birthed the most important theoretical text of the era, The State and Revolution.
To understand the context for this book, we have to move forward to the summer of 1917.
So following a spontaneous, aborted uprising in July, known as the July Days, the provisional government cracks down violently on the Bolsheviks.
They issue arrest warrants, alleging the Bolsheviks are German provocateurs.
So Lenin is forced back into hiding. He shaves his beard, crosses the border into Finland, and hides in a hayloft.
And while he is literally running from the police apparatus of the bourgeois state, he writes a book analyzing the structural nature of that very apparatus.
It's incredible. The State and Revolution is fundamentally an exercise in what Lenin called historical excavation.
He believed that the moderate socialists of the Second International People, like the German Marxist Trotsky or the Russian Mensheviks, had deliberately buried and watered down the original revolutionary teachings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels regarding the state.
Lenin set out to resurrect the genuine radical core of Marxist political theory.
Let's dig into the core argument here, because it completely shatters the way most people intuitively understand government.
Yeah. In liberal democratic theory, we are taught that the state is essentially a neutral umpire.
It exists above society to balance the competing interests of different groups.
Capital and labor, rich and poor, to maintain order and ensure peaceful coexistence.
Lenin attacks that concept relentlessly. Drawing heavily on Engels, Lenin argues that the state is not a neutral arbiter.
It is the product and the physical manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms.
Irreconcilability, meaning it is impossible for the classes to coexist peacefully.
Right. Lenin argues that if classes could truly be reconciled, the state wouldn't even need to exist.
The state only arises historically when class conflict between those who own property and those who don't becomes so intense that society would destroy itself in a perpetual civil war if there weren't a superior force to impose order.
But here is the crucial pivot. That order is not neutral.
No, not at all.
Lenin defines the state as an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is, in his famous formulation, a special repressive force.
And when he says special repressive force, he is not speaking metaphorically.
Right. He means the tangible, physical mechanisms of coercion.
The standing army, the police, the prison system, the courts.
These are the armed men who enforce the property rights and the political dominance of the bourgeoisie.
Lenin argues that even in the most progressive, democratic parliamentary republic, this state machinery is ultimately a dictatorial tool used by capital to exploit wage labor.
I want to focus on how Lenin positions this theory against the other socialist factions, because he is fighting a two-front theoretical war in this text.
Definitely. First, he takes aim at the petty bourgeois Menshevik view.
Lenin basically accuses them of hallucinating. They believed the state existed to reconcile classes.
And therefore, if you just elected enough socialists to the bourgeois parliament, you could gradually use the existing state to legislate socialism into existence peacefully.
Lenin dismisses that as a utopian fantasy that totally ignores the physical reality of who controls the army and the police.
And the second front of his theoretical war is against what he calls the Kautskyite distortion, named after Karl Kautsky.
This was far more insidious, right? Because the Kautskyites nominally agreed with Marxist theory.
They admitted that the state was an instrument of class rule.
But they conveniently forgot the practical conclusion Marx drew from the Paris Commune of 1871.
Exactly. Marx had observed the Paris Commune and concluded that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes.
The existing state was structurally designed for bourgeois exploitation.
Lenin hammered home the implication. The proletariat cannot inherit the bourgeois state. They must violently smash it.
Smashing the state. I think an analogy is really useful here to understand the mechanics of what Lenin is proposing.
Yeah, let's hear.
Think of the state not as an empty vessel you can just pour new laws into, but as a highly specialized piece of heavy machinery. It's a bulldozer.
Okay.
A bulldozer is designed for a very specific purpose: to demolish, to crush, to exert brute force.
That maps perfectly onto Lenin's concept of the state as a repressive apparatus.
Right. So the Mensheviks are essentially saying, let's win a majority in parliament, take over the controls of the bulldozer, and then use it to perform delicate heart surgery on the Russian economy.
And Lenin is looking at them and saying, you can't do heart surgery with a bulldozer.
The machine only knows how to destroy. It was built for the specific violence of the rich crushing the poor. You have to dismantle the bulldozer entirely, melt down the scrap metal, and build a completely new instrument.
And that new instrument, The replacement for the smashed bourgeois state is the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Now, we have to pause here, because the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat carries an immense amount of historical baggage for modern listeners.
Oh, definitely.
We need to define exactly what Lenin meant by it in the summer of 1917, before the reality of the Civil War altered its implementation.
In Lenin's theoretical framework, every state is a dictatorship of one class over another.
Right. A capitalist democracy is just a hidden dictatorship of the bourgeoisie.
So when the workers smash that state, they must create a new kind of state. A worker state based on the democratic councils of the Soviets, backed by the armed populace.
To actively suppress the inevitable resistance of the former exploiting classes.
It's still a special repressive force, but for the first time in history, it is the majority repressing the minority.
I have to push back on the inherent danger of this logic, though. If the entire goal of socialism is human liberation, and your first step is to construct a new, potentially worse machine of violence and coercion, aren't you just replacing one tyranny with another?
That is the big question.
How does creating a special repressive force lead to a free society? This is where critics of Leninism argue the seeds of totalitarianism are baked right into the DNA of the theory.
And Lenin attempts to answer that exact critique in the final chapters of The State and Revolution. He introduces the most profoundly utopian element of his political thought.
Which is?
He argues that this new worker state is fundamentally unique because it is a transitional state. It is a state designed to eventually make itself obsolete.
Ah, the concept of the state withering away.
Exactly. Lenin argues that the only reason a state needs to exist is to manage irreconcilable class conflict.
So once the dictatorship of the proletariat successfully expropriates the capitalists, socializes the means of production, and abolishes class distinctions entirely, the root cause of societal conflict is removed.
Because there is no longer a bourgeoisie to oppress, and no proletariat to be exploited. Everyone is simply a worker.
Therefore, the need for a special repressive force simply evaporates.
The state won't be overthrown, it will gradually wither away. The vast apparatus of police, prisons, and standing armies will be replaced by the armed population themselves, and eventually, even that won't be necessary.
Lenin's vision here is startlingly optimistic. I mean, he argues that the administration of people, the coercive element of government, will be replaced by the simple administration of things.
Accounting, distributing resources, managing infrastructure.
He envisions a society where people become so accustomed to observing the basic rules of social life without force, without subjection, that the very concept of a coercive state apparatus becomes alien.
It leads to the higher phase of communist society governed by the principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
It is a brilliantly constructed theoretical architecture.
It really is. It offers this ruthless, unsentimental justification for extreme violence and the immediate seizure of power, smashing the state while simultaneously pairing it with the most elevated, emancipatory promise of ultimate human freedom.
So armed with this uncompromising theoretical weapon, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now on a collision course with the provisional government.
The fragile arrangement of dual power was about to explode.
Yeah, because as Trotsky analyzes, dual power is inherently unstable. It is a state of social crisis that contains the seeds of civil war. It cannot last.
Two competing sovereign wills cannot coexist in the same geographic space. One must inevitably annihilate the other.
Let's trace the mechanics of that final escalation from the late summer into the autumn of 1917. How does the theory of smashing the state translate into the reality of the October Revolution?
Well, by August, the provisional government, now led entirely by Alexander Kerensky, is essentially paralyzed.
The Russian army is collapsing on the Eastern Front, inflation is destroying the urban economy,
And the peasantry is violently seizing aristocratic estates in the countryside.
So the liberal bourgeoisie and the military high command look at this chaos, look at the radicalizing Soviets, and decide they need a dictator to restore order.
They decide to smash the Soviets before the Soviets can smash them. And their chosen instrument is General Laver Kornilov.
Kornilov was the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Russian army.
Right. And in late August, he orchestrates a right-wing military coup.
He orders elite cavalry divisions to march on Petrograd with the explicit goal of hanging the Soviet leaders, destroying the Bolsheviks, and establishing a military dictatorship.
And the Kerensky government is caught completely flat-footed. They have no troops loyal to them, capable of stopping Kornilov.
Which leads to the supreme irony of 1917. The provisional government is saved from destruction by the very radical forces they had been trying to suppress.
Kerensky is forced to arm the workers and call upon the Bolsheviks to defend the capital.
I want to spend some time on the exact mechanics of how the Kornilov coup was defeated, because it wasn't defeated in a pitched military battle.
No, not at all.
It was defeated by the logistical superiority of the working class.
When Kornilov's troop trains approached Petrograd, they didn't run into an army. They ran into the Railway Workers' Union.
The railway workers simply tore up the tracks. They redirected telegraph orders, so Kornilov's generals were receiving conflicting, nonsensical instructions.
They stranded the trains in the middle of nowhere.
And while the elite troops were sitting in immobilized rail cars, the Petrograd Soviet flooded the ranks with agitators.
Sailors, factory workers, even Muslim delegates who spoke the languages of Kornilov's Caucasian cavalry divisions.
The so-called Savage Division.
Right. These agitators essentially infiltrated the stalled trains and explained to the soldiers that they were being used by a reactionary general to crush the revolution and restore the old regime.
And the soldiers who were just exhausted and wanted peace mutinied against their officers. The coup dissolved from the inside out without a single major artillery shell being fired.
The Kornilov affair completely broke the political landscape wide open.
It validated everything Lenin had been arguing since April.
It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the bourgeois state was not a neutral empire. It was perfectly willing to use brute military violence to crush the democratic organs of the workers.
And it utterly destroyed the credibility of the compromisers, the Mensheviks and the right-wing SRs.
For 6 months, they'd been telling the workers that the provisional government was the safeguard of the revolution.
Now, the workers saw that the provisional government was a breeding ground for counter-revolution.
Following the collapse of the coup, the political tide shifts decisively.
In early September, for the first time, the Bolsheviks win a commanding majority in the Petrograd Soviet.
And a few days later, they win the Moscow Soviet.
The abstract slogan, "All power to the Soviets," now has a concrete, immediate meaning: all power to the Bolsheviks.
Lenin, who is still hiding in Finland, realizes the historical window is closing.
Right. If they wait, Kerensky might surrender Petrograd to the Germans just to crush the revolution. Or another right-wing general might succeed where Kornilov failed.
So Lenin begins bombarding the Bolshevik Central Committee with frantic letters demanding an immediate armed insurrection.
He literally writes, "History will not forgive us if we do not assume power now."
But yet again, we have to shatter the myth of the monolithic Bolshevik Party.
Because when Lenin demands an uprising, the Central Committee does not uniformly salute and fall in line.
No, we see one final agonizing internal struggle over the nature of power.
And the resistance is led once again by Lev Kamenev, this time joined by another senior old Bolshevik, Grigory Zinoviev.
Kamenev's inherent caution reasserts itself. He and Zinoviev are absolutely terrified of an armed uprising.
They argue that the Bolsheviks might have a majority in the urban Soviets, but they don't have the support of the vast peasant majority in the provinces.
They fear that if they seize power alone, the international proletariat won't come to their aid. They will be blockaded, starved out, and eventually slaughtered by a united counter-revolution.
So they advocate waiting for the upcoming Constituent Assembly to form a broad socialist coalition.
And they don't just argue this internally.
No, they commit an act of factional sabotage that is almost unbelievable.
Having been outvoted in the Central Committee, Kamenev and Zinoviev actually publish a letter in a non-Bolshevik newspaper, Novaya Zin,
publicly arguing against the imminent secret uprising. They essentially leak the plans for the October Revolution to the press, warning the public that a Bolshevik coup would lead to ruin.
Lenin's reaction from hiding was explosive. He viewed it as the ultimate betrayal, an act of treason in the face of the enemy.
He called them strikebreakers and demanded their immediate expulsion from the party.
Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, I want to look at Stalin's behavior during this critical, highly volatile moment.
Yeah.
Because it adds so much texture to our understanding of his political instincts.
If we return to Trotsky's characterization of Stalin as an empiric and a bureaucratic maneuverer, his actions on the eve of October are deeply revealing.
Stalin is on the Central Committee. He formally votes with Lenin in favor of the insurrection.
Right. But when Kamenev and Zinoviev publish their leak and Lenin demands their expulsion, Stalin uses his editorial position at Pravda to hedge his bets.
He publishes an editorial note defending Kamenev and Zinoviev.
He criticizes Lenin's harsh tone, arguing that the disagreement was merely a tactical difference among comrades. He explicitly states that the party should remain united with Kamenev.
It is the ultimate act of political double-entry bookkeeping.
Trotsky argues quite persuasively that Stalin was building a bridge for a retreat.
Right. If the armed insurrection failed, if Lenin and Trotsky were arrested or shot, Stalin could point to his defense of Kamenev and say, "See, I was a voice of caution. I tried to moderate their extremism."
But if the uprising succeeded, well, his vote was officially recorded with the majority. He remained in the shadows, avoiding the frontline risk of the insurrection itself.
But the insurrection does not fail.
No, it doesn't. The actual execution of the October takeover is largely directed by Leon Trotsky as the president of the Petrograd Soviet through a body called the Military Revolutionary Committee.
And compared to the spontaneous, bloody chaos of February, the October insurrection is a masterpiece of logistical precision.
It was an armed uprising, but it felt almost like a police operation.
On the night of October 24th and the morning of the 25th, detachments of Red Guards and sailors systematically occupied the strategic nerve centers of Petrograd.
They seized the central telegraph office, the telephone exchange, the railway stations, the printing presses, and the power plants.
The provisional government, isolated in the Winter Palace, simply found that the machinery of the city had been unplugged around them.
This brings us to the dramatic culmination of the dual power. On the evening of October 25th, while the cannons of the cruiser Aurora are firing blank shells over the Neva River, and Red Guards are storming the Winter Palace to arrest the ministers of the provisional government.
The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets opens at the Smolny Institute.
The Congress is packed with delegates from across the empire. And for the first time, the Bolsheviks hold a commanding majority, supported by the left wing of the social revolutionaries.
And how do the former prophets of dual power react? The Mensheviks and the moderate SRs, the people who had voluntarily handed power to the bourgeoisie back in February?
They are completely apoplectic. Instead of recognizing the democratic mandate of the Soviet Congress, instead of fighting alongside the workers who had just deposed a failing capitalist government, they denounce the Bolsheviks for conducting an illegal, violent coup.
They demand the immediate disarmament of the Military Revolutionary Committee.
And they insist on negotiating a coalition government with the very forces that had backed Kornilov.
When the Bolsheviks refuse to surrender the power they have just seized, the Mensheviks and the right SRs make a fateful decision.
They stand up, denounce the entire proceedings, and storm out of the Congress.
They walk out into the Petrograd night, leaving the Bolsheviks and the left SRs alone to ratify the insurrection and form the world's first workers' government.
The Council of People's Commissars, headed by Vladimir Lenin.
By walking out, they essentially amputated themselves from the historical process.
As Trotsky ruthlessly noted in his history observing their departure, moral principle undoubtedly slammed the door only to run into the crude physical force of the Bolsheviks and back down.
The era of dvovlasti, of dual power, was decisively over.
The old state machinery, the bulldozer of the bourgeoisie, had been smashed. A radically new mechanism of power, the dictatorship of the proletariat, was being forged in the fires of civil war.
Which brings us to the broader implications of this immense historical journey. The events of 1917 are not just a contained historical artifact. They are a masterclass in the mechanics of systemic collapse and radical change.
Yeah, when you think about how we navigate moments of profound crisis today, whether it's political instability, technological disruption, or institutional failure, it is incredibly common for leadership to default to old, comfortable paradigms.
We look at the Kamenevs of the world, who tried to force the unprecedented reality of the Russian Revolution into a decades-old Marxist textbook.
And we recognize that instinct to compromise with failing systems because it feels safer than the unknown.
But as Lenin demonstrated in April, and as Trotsky details throughout his history, profound historical momentum is not generated by clinging to obsolete theories.
It requires the intellectual courage to recognize when the foundational rules of the game have irrevocably changed.
It requires someone to step in front of their own supporters and demand that they abandon their comfort zones.
And crucially, it requires a rigorous theoretical framework to explain why the old machinery must be dismantled, just as Lenin did with the state and revolution.
You can't just tear down a system without a comprehensive blueprint for what replaces it.
However, before we conclude, we must address the chilling, unresolved paradox that echoes through the subsequent decades. A paradox drawn directly from the later life and writings of Leon Trotsky himself.
This is the tragic epilogue to the October Revolution.
We spent a lot of time discussing Lenin's justification for seizing power. The idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat was a transitional state, a special repressive force that would inevitably, organically wither away as classes were abolished and true freedom was achieved.
That utopian promise was the moral engine that mobilized millions of workers and peasants.
Yet, if you look at what actually transpired just 20 years later in the 1930s, the Soviet state did not wither away.
No. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the cautious committeeman, the empiric, who had hedged his bets during the insurrection, the state metastasized into something entirely unprecedented.
It evolved into a hyper-centralized, totalitarian police apparatus. It utilized terror and coercion not just against the remnants of the old bourgeoisie, but against the peasantry, against the working class.
And eventually against the very old Bolshevik revolutionaries who had organized the October Uprising.
Trotsky himself, the architect of the Military Revolutionary Committee, would be exiled and eventually assassinated by the very state machinery he helped forge.
The mechanism built to liberate the oppressed became an autonomous engine of repression.
So this is the thought we want to leave you to mull over today as you digest the complexities of 1917. When you decide that the only way to achieve ultimate human freedom is to temporarily construct a massive, highly efficient machine of coercion.
What happens when that machine decides it enjoys the power far too much to ever wither away?
It is the defining political tragedy of the 20th century and a structural warning about the nature of power itself. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to seek out the primary sources. Read Trotsky, read Lenin, read the contemporary accounts, question the neat historical narratives, and keep diving deep.